In the cold heart of Castile, the wind whispers through stone corridors where candles trembled, as if afraid of the stories they had heard. Servants spoke in low voices, their eyes darting toward the shadows that moved behind the queen's chamber door. They said she had been touched by darkness, that her mind was no longer her own, that the curse of an ancient evil had chosen her as its vessel. Her name was Juana of Castile, daughter of the great Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. History would call her Juana la Loca, Joan, the Mad, the queen who lost her reason and her crown. Yet the truth was far more cruel than madness. What the world saw as possession was in fact the slow decay of a body devoured from within. What they called insanity was the sorrow of a woman kidnapped by the very blood that should have protected her. In the silent halls of her palace, power and superstition were woven together. Courtiers bowed not out of loyalty, but out of fear. They whispered that the queen's eyes glowed in candlelight, that her prayers turned into cries, that her beauty had melted into something unnatural. But beneath every rumor lies a forgotten truth. Juana was not cursed by the devil. She was destroyed by the ignorance of her age, by the greed of men who found it easier to call her mad than to understand her pain. This is not a tale of sorcery or madness. It is the story of what happens when power meets suffering, when a crown becomes a chain, and when a woman's silence is mistaken for insanity. Stay with me as we walk through the haunted chambers of her life. And if you believe history still hides its cruelest truths behind royal walls, subscribe to our channel, where every silence has a story to tell. At the end of the 15th century, Spain stood on the edge of glory. Under the rule of Ferdinand and Isabella, the crowns of Castile and Aragon were bound together not by peace, but by conquest. The Inquisition burned in the name of faith, and the banner of the Catholic monarchs rose above the ashes of the old kingdoms. Out of this union of blood and belief came a daughter born to serve destiny. Her name was Juana. From her first breath, she belonged not to herself, but to Spain. Every word she learned, every gesture she mastered, was shaped for diplomacy, not affection. She grew beneath the gold of the court, where incense and iron coexisted. Her tutors filled her mind with theology and languages, while her mother taught her that a royal woman's silence was her sharpest weapon. Yet even within the confines of duty, something in Juana's nature resisted the cold order of the world. She possessed the kind of beauty that seemed to hide a secret, a quiet flame that drew eyes, but also caution. The ambassadors who watched her described her as a candle burning in stillness, too bright for its own safety. When she reached 17, her life was decided without her consent. Her parents arranged her marriage to Philip, the son of Emperor Maximilian, heir to the House of Habsburg. It was not a union of hearts, but of empires, a bond meant to secure the strength of Spain across Europe. To Ferdinand and Isabella, Juana was a bridge of blood between thrones. To Philip, she was a path to power. The wedding took place in Flanders, under skies the color of steel. Juana arrived from the sunlit palaces of Castile to a land of mist and cold stone, carrying the promise of a future she could not yet see. She was radiant, then, her beauty untouched by illness, her body strong, her spirit unbroken. When she met Philip for the first time, the court gasped at their youth, at the perfection of two dynasties made flesh. Yet behind every smile lay a purpose older than love. That night, as the bells of Ghent rang and torches burned through the fog, Juana looked at her new husband and saw the reflection of a fate she did not choose. Around them, the music of celebration echoed like a prophecy. The union that began with silk and gold would one day end in grief and stone. The carriages rolled through the streets of Flanders, while the people cheered for a future they believed was blessed. Inside one of them sat a young queen, with eyes full of wonder, unaware that every mile carried her farther from herself. She smiled at the crowd, through the glass window, her heart trembling with hope. But the wind that swept her veil whispered another truth, a truth that even the angels dared not speak. The seed of her tragedy had already been planted, waiting for the moment when love and betrayal would become one. Philip, the handsome Duke of Burgundy and heir to the Holy Roman Empire, was a man sculpted by vanity and destiny. His beauty was the talk of Europe, a blend of golden hair, proud posture, and the confidence of one who had never been denied. Artists sought his likeness, poets praised his charm, and courtiers called him a prince favored by God himself. Yet behind the radiance of his youth lived a colder truth. Philip had learned early that admiration was a kind of power, and power once tasted left no room for tenderness. When he met Juana of Castile, their first encounter was not gentle. It was sudden, almost violent in its intensity. The chronicles speak of how he ignored all ceremony and pulled her into his arms before the court, sealing their union with a kiss that defied royal decorum. That moment became legend, a spectacle of desire between two young monarchs, bound by politics and flesh. Their marriage began like a fever burning bright enough to blind them both. In the early years, Juana believed that love could civilize him. She followed him from palace to palace through courts, heavy with intrigue, trying to hold together a man who loved conquest more than affection. But Philip's heart belonged to his own reflection. Surrounded by flatterers and mistresses, he treated Juana's devotion as something to mock. What had once been passion became humiliation, and what had been love turned into the slow torture of jealousy. Each betrayal carved deeper into her. She could not eat, could not sleep. Her thoughts circled him endlessly, a cage made of her own desperation. After every childbirth, her body weakened. Her face grew round. Her skin puffed. Her strength drained away. Her maids whispered prayers saying the queen was changing, that her beauty was fading under the shadow of divine punishment. But it was no curse. It was the quiet hand of illness, the invisible ruin of a woman exhausted by sorrow and sleeplessness, by the weight of her love and her crown. When Philip fell ill in 1506, the court pretended to mourn, but Juana's grief was real. His death shattered her completely. She refused to believe the silence in his chest. For nights she kept the coffin beside her, speaking to it, as if he still heard her. When they moved his body across Castile, she followed on foot through the winter dark, her gown soaked in rain, her eyes fixed on the wooden box that held the man she could not let go. To the courtiers it was madness. To history it became legend. But in truth it was love stripped of reason, grief stripped of dignity. Juana was not insane. She was human in a world that punished humanity. The same court that once envied her beauty now feared her sorrow, because nothing is more dangerous to power than a woman who refuses to forget. After the death of Philip the Handsome, the kingdom of Castile fell into uncertainty. Power trembled between thrones, and in that silence stepped Ferdinand of Aragon, King of Spain, and father of Juana of Castile, a man known for his cunning as much as his devotion to the crown. He had once united a divided land through faith and fire. Now he sought to unite it again, but this time through the suffering of his own daughter. He arrived in Castile wrapped in the dignity of a savior. Before the nobles and clergy, he spoke of duty and divine order. With calm words, he declared that Queen Juana, his beloved child, was too fragile to rule her mind, broken by grief, her heart consumed by sorrow. He promised to govern only until she was well again. The court listened in silence, and when he placed his seal upon her throne, no one dared to object. Thus, under the guise of protection, he became regent of Castile. Behind palace doors, compassion dissolved into control. Juana, still mourning the man she had loved, found her chambers turned into a cage. Servants whispered that the king visited her rarely, that her meals were brought in silence, that her name was slowly erased from proclamations and decrees. The father who once swore to guard her blood now used it to justify his rule. He told Europe that his daughter was mad, and the world believed him, for it was easier to accept a mad queen than a silenced one. Years passed like slow rain against stone. When King Ferdinand of Aragon finally died, the power that had chained Juana did not die with him. Her son Charles of Habsburg, now Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, crossed the sea from Flanders to claim what was left of Spain. He was young, ambitious, and already shaped by the logic of empire. In public, he spoke of filial respect. In private, he feared the shadow of his mother's claim. Charles visited her once in Tordesillas. Witnesses wrote that she reached for his hand, but he withdrew it gently. He addressed her not as a son, but as a ruler addressing a subject. Soon after, he ordered the guards to keep her under permanent confinement. The title of queen remained hers, but only in ink. From that moment, every decree signed in her name was a lie written by another hand. The story of Juana's madness became the anthem of the Spanish court. Priests repeated it in sermons, ambassadors carried it across Europe, chroniclers inked it into history. Madness was a convenient truth, a veil that concealed ambition and betrayal. Power did not need to spill blood to bury her. It only had to name her insane, close the door, and let silence finish the work. In that silence, Juana of Castile ceased to be a woman of flesh and became a legend of fear, a lesson whispered to every queen who dared to feel too deeply. The royal monastery of Santa Clara in Tordesillas stood like a fortress above the river Duero, its walls heavy with the damp breath of the north. It had once been a place of prayer, but under royal order, it became a place of silence. There, behind its narrow windows and thick iron doors, Queen Juana of Castile was kept from the world she had once ruled. The guards called it protection, the court called it mercy, but to Juana it was neither. It was a slow burial carried out in daylight. Her rooms were cold even in summer. The only window was too high to reach, and the light that passed through it was weak and gray. Every morning the nuns brought her bread and water, bowing, but never speaking. Every night the guards turned the key and waited for the whisper of her prayers before leaving her alone again. She lived beneath constant watch, her footsteps echoing in corridors that led nowhere. The air smelled of wax, metal, and fear. Over the years, her body changed as much as her world. The swelling that had once begun around her face grew worse. Her cheeks became round and pale, her eyes sunken and ringed with shadows. Her skin lost its color, her hands trembled, her breath shortened. The courtiers who came to visit her left in silence, shaken by what they saw. Rumors spread across Castile that the queen's body was no longer human, that her voice called to spirits when the moon was full. Servants whispered that she spoke to her dead husband, that she could hear the cries of souls wandering along the river. The priests saw sin where there was only sickness. They said the queen was touched by the devil, that her body was the vessel of punishment for her past defiance. They performed rituals, sprinkled holy water, read prayers over her bed. But nothing changed, because the cause was not unholy. It was human. Years of grief had broken her mind's balance, and the illness inside her glands filled her flesh with the weight of her despair. In those long hours, Juana turned to prayer, not for salvation, but for remembrance. She spoke to God softly, asking not to die, but to endure. Death would have freed her, but survival was her final act of rebellion. As long as she breathed, she was still queen, still daughter of Isabella, still the rightful sovereign of Castile. Sometimes, she pressed her hand against the cold wall and imagined the kingdom beyond it. She thought of her children, now rulers of distant lands who never came to see her. She thought of the bells of Granada, of the voices that once shouted her name. The world had chosen to forget her, but she refused to forget herself. Each dawn rose the same way, pale and trembling, through the small window of her prison. Yet within that frail light, she whispered a vow to live. For in a world that had taken everything from her existence itself, had become her final crown. When Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, ascended to the greatest throne in Europe, the name of his mother faded from every proclamation. Courtiers spoke of lineage, not of blood. They celebrated his victories and his empire of gold, but never mentioned the woman whose crown had made his power possible. Within the walls of Tordesillas, Juana of Castile remained alive, yet to the world, she was already a shadow erased by silence. She continued to write letters, fragile pieces of parchment, that carried her voice beyond her cell. Each one began with the same words, "Yo la reina, I, the queen." No one dared to reply. The letters were read, sealed again, and hidden in royal archives, their ink fading beside the dust of forgotten decrees. They were the last echoes of a woman who refused to let the world name her otherwise. In Madrid and Brussels, men of faith and history built their version of her story. They called her a mad woman, touched by divine punishment, a soul consumed by sin and melancholy. The chroniclers, almost all men, painted her not as a monarch, but as a warning, an example of how passion could destroy reason. Their pens turned her humanity into spectacle, her sorrow into legend. Yet beneath the words of those who judged her lay the truth of a woman punished not for her madness, but for her emotion. Within the monastery, time lost its meaning. The sound of the river outside marked the seasons better than any calendar. Juana's days were measured by prayers and the shifting of sunlight on the floor. Her body had grown frail, but her eyes still carried the same quiet defiance. When the guards entered her chamber, she lifted her head with the dignity of someone who remembered who she was. Her throne had been reduced to an old wooden chair, its legs uneven and worn by years, but when she sat upon it, the servants still bowed. To them, she was not a prisoner. She was their queen. Occasionally, messengers arrived from court, with gifts meant to soothe her conscience. Rosaries of gold silks, she never wore fruit, she rarely ate. They were offerings of guilt disguised as kindness. Juana accepted them with grace, thanked them as a sovereign would, and returned to her prayers. Her silence became her power. The less she spoke, the more her presence filled the room. Outside her cell, the empire of her son stretched from Europe to the Americas. But inside Tordesillas, the woman who had given it life remained unseen. Her story became a wound that history tried to heal with forgetting. Yet memory persisted in the hearts of those who served her. They whispered her name in their nightly prayers and carried her image in secret, a reminder that beneath crowns and creeds, love and pain could make a monarch far greater than power ever could. In that hidden world of dust and devotion, Juana of Castile endured not as the mad queen they proclaimed, but as the last living truth of a kingdom built upon her silence. In the spring of 1555, after nearly half a century of confinement, Queen Juana of Castile took her final breath inside the monastery of Tordesillas. There were no royal banners, no mourning bells across Spain, no crown placed upon her coffin. Her passing was marked by silence, as if the kingdom itself had conspired to forget the woman who once bore its name. The guards who had watched her for decades crossed themselves in quiet fear, uncertain whether they were witnessing an ending or a release. Her body was laid in a simple wooden coffin, far from the splendor that had once surrounded her birth. Outside the river, Duero flowed as it always had, indifferent to the rise and fall of empires. Within her cell, the light lingered on the stone walls where her shadow had moved for so many years. On a small table stood an old mirror, its surface cracked, its frame dulled by time. It was said that the mirror still reflected her face in the final hours, no longer the beauty of her youth, but something deeper, a gaze that refused surrender. Her reflection carried the quiet dignity of one who had endured everything that power and betrayal could inflict. They called her mad because they could not control her. They called her cursed because they could not understand her. In truth, Juana was neither. She was a woman born into a world that mistook sensitivity for weakness and emotion for danger. Her tragedy was not madness, but the cruelty of a time that feared the depth of a woman's heart. History has long been written by those who survive it. The men who named her insane carved their authority upon her silence. They built their empires on the myth of her fragility, never admitting that the chains they placed upon her were forged from fear. Power always trembles before what it cannot define, and Juana was something no decree could capture. She loved beyond reason, grieved beyond permission, and lived beyond the boundaries that her age allowed. Centuries have passed, yet her story endures like the faint echo of a song once forbidden. In every mirror where her image might have faded, her eyes still meet ours, reminding us that no prison is eternal and no silence is complete. She remains not as the mad queen of history's convenience, but as a symbol of resilience, of the quiet defiance that survives beneath crowns and chains alike. If you believe history hides its cruelest truths behind royal walls, subscribe to our channel where every silence has a scream.